This is Barry Blake. I'm Associate Executive Director of SMI, and I'm very pleased to welcome Debra Bruemmer from the Mayo Clinic, who's going to run us through some material on cybersecurity. Debra, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you, Barry.
Excellent. Yes. And so how this came about, when we asked about cyber at our spring forum, our members rated it pretty much off the charts as one of their areas of concern, which is not a surprise, I think, to anybody who's joined this webinar. It's a threat to patient safety. Attacks can knock supply chains offline for an extended periods of time, so it's something that organizations spend a lot of time focused on, and that's why we asked Debra here. We asked her here because of Mayo's robust approach to cyber. Debra actually shared a version of what she's presenting today at our spring forum, and it was, just so you know, it was one of our highest rated sessions. So very cool stuff coming your way. Just a couple of housekeeping things. All lines are going to be muted during this webinar, but please feel free to ask any questions using the question tab on the pane to your right. So with that, Debra, I happily hand over to you to take us through the material.
Well, thank you, Barry, and I appreciate an opportunity to speak to your group today and share Mayo Clinic's strategy, journey, and approach. And just for a little bit more background for those listening in today, the focus of my talk is really going to be about the need to secure your medical devices. Most of us understand about our workstations and servers, and sometimes these special purpose computers get left behind and get less thought given to them. So I want to share some proactive actions that I feel can be taken to secure those pieces of equipment as you go through your journey of hardening the security posture of your healthcare organization. So as we look at this, cybersecurity is a known threat in our industry, and many people think that we're probably in front of it. And I guess the unfortunate answer to this is that we really aren't. As an industry, we still have a lot of work ahead of us in order to harden our environments, and ultimately, as we think in the context of medical devices, to secure patient safety with the use of those devices. So looking at that, if your organization is taking the approach to wait for this magical moment or something magic to happen to address this issue for you, I don't think that's really a viable option. I don't see cybersecurity to be going away anytime soon as an issue that we as healthcare organizations and even within the healthcare industry need to address. And bottom line is, I'm not sure it's even an appropriate reaction for that. We have patients' lives on the line in some cases, thinking about a hospital setting. So we want to be sure to protect them as they're in our care. And then also thinking about the types of data. Secondly, thinking data and not just about physical harm. When you think about a credit card, when that's stolen, that piece of information can easily be replaced and a new card issued. I don't know for those on the phone, but it happens to me regularly. And the point of this is that data about a person's health history, that can't be changed. That's something that will be stagnant. So with those two concepts in mind, really waiting for a magical moment is not a best approach. So thinking about Mayo Clinic's mission and the needs of the patient coming first, this is really why Mayo Clinic has been a very vocal advocate to improve the security posture of medical devices that we use in the care of our patients. And so with that backdrop, I'd like to kind of proceed forward with a few additional background slides. So despite all of our growing awareness, obviously if it was an interest at the Spring Forum, people are aware and they want to take action, but it does seem to be that the status quo does continue a bit. And I personally think that there's three reasons as to why that's happening. The first one is that we do have limited resources when you think of the healthcare industry. What that equates to is we likely have very thin margins within our healthcare delivery organizations. Also, when you think about that, 70% or around that number have less than 200 hospital beds, so they're not very large organizations. And then when you think about device manufacturers, the majority of them are small as well. They're not the large mega manufacturers that many of us tend to think of in our first starting point. So thinking about that, we're competing for scarce resources, meaning people that have knowledge and understanding of cyber risk and cybersecurity, and it's just very hard for our industry to compete. Secondly, when you think about the devices used in our businesses, medical devices are an easy target for cyber attack. Many times, if you think about this, the shelf life of the medical equipment that we use is very long, while the technology that it's built on has a shorter shelf life. So if you think about the Windows operating system, Microsoft is very clear. They develop an operating system with an expected life of 10 years. If you develop on that platform at the beginning of the OS release, you've got 10 years before you've got an issue and it's no longer supported or patchable. If you build on it at the very end of that 10-year life cycle, it's only going to have a shelf life from a technology perspective of 1-2 years, whatever that distance is till the end game. So thinking about that disparity in the technology and the usefulness of the device. Also looking at this, you know, I know for our organization, we continue to see devices trying to be sold running Windows XP, which has been unsupported for almost 4 years now. And then the other thing you need to think about as you think of your organization is the large presence of Windows 7. These are going to, that end of support in January of 2020, which is really not that far away, is going to make our organizations running medical equipment even more vulnerable, thinking about that going forward. Not to mention, if you add on, if those medical devices are not currently patched, there will be a bunch of known vulnerabilities that there's no hope of addressing through an upgrade path or a patching mechanism. Then you think about the third point is that our industry tends to manage risk through guidance. So, you know, the point that the FDA has some very good pre and post market, you'll see on the images at the bottom of my slide, they're non-binding recommendations. And so it does put us in a little bit of a conundrum as far as proceeding forward and nudging along our device manufacturers. So really the bottom line is that healthcare providers can't manage medical devices like they do their other technology. And that, again, is placing us as organizations such as Mayo, healthcare delivery organizations, putting a big target on us. So really thinking forward, you know, what can be done to address the cybersecurity in newly purchased devices? And now I'm putting out that question here, and you might be wondering why I'm not asking that question about legacy devices. And really what Mayo has learned along our 4-year journey is that assessing medical devices that are coming new into our organization is much more effective than looking at devices that we currently own or our legacy in our environment. We just simply have lost the leverage, and then we also go back to how long has that device been in our environment. It's not uncommon for large capital assets such as an MRI to be in a healthcare organization's environment for, you know, 20 years. It's a purpose-built computer and it continues to function. So our approach and strategy has been, let's develop a robust process to be able to understand what we're bringing new into the organization before we write that actual check out to the device manufacturer. And prior to really talking about Mayo's in-depth strategy and lessons that we've learned and some proactive actions, is I think it's helpful for others to understand what Mayo Clinic's philosophy is when we come down to addressing medical equipment. So really, it's based on 4 key tenets, and one is focusing in on the procurement process, as I was just sharing. And that includes things such as being engaged in the RFP process before purchase decisions are even made, having standard contract language, thinking about budgeting cycles, getting in front of large purchasers of medical equipment. I know for our organization, we do have departments that tend to spend a whole lot more money than others. We actually start reaching out to them and understanding where they're going and reminding them about trying to engage with us. I do want to be clear, though, at Mayo Clinic, security does not drive the purchase decision. The practice drives the purchase decision. Our physicians and clinical staff are the ones who know which pieces of equipment from a clinical perspective are the best to use in the care of their patients. What my team's role is in security at large is to enable a secure execution or implementation of that device. We do raise red flags, and we'll talk about that as we get into our process and strategy, but clearly we want the practice to make the decision about which device to bring in, and then we partner with them. The second tenet is to test medical devices. Really, and testing can take a couple of forms, and for Mayo it means that we will do vulnerability, full hands-on testing of products and not wait for the vendor to do it. If we're going to do a large multi-million-dollar purchase or buy a pool of devices, like devices, so for example, I'm going to buy thousands of infusion pumps, we want to understand that product before we bring it in. We are moving to push this testing to the device manufacturers or the vendors of these medical devices, but Mayo still clearly does do some of that. The third part of our philosophy is anytime we have do a security test or do a vulnerability assessment or a documentation review, we share all that information with the device vendor. We outline actions, timelines, expectations. Our goal is to collaborate with those vendors. It is not to make public disclosures, because the bottom line is these vulnerabilities need to be fixed in the deployment of the device before our patients are really safe from those vulnerabilities being exploited. The last part of our philosophy is really utilizing Mayo's influence to benefit society. So how we do this, or how we feel we're doing this, is we require changes in the standard product. We're not looking for a one-off change for Mayo Clinic. And so we're hoping that this will drive changes in the vendor's internal processes at the long term. So really the key point of our philosophy is really to partner with vendors for safe outcomes, and that will include us providing input and partnering with these vendors as they go along that journey as well. So just to give you a little bit of statistics to support where Mayo's journey has been, we've been doing medical device assessments for 4+ years. I'm only showing statistics for the last 3, and the statistics for 2018 were through the end of first quarter only, so we're on target to be close to about 400 this calendar year. But the point of sharing this is that I do feel Mayo has learned a lot along our journey, and we've seen a lot of devices. We've engaged a lot of unique device vendors. We've reached out to 218 of them throughout our journey to date. And along with that, I think it's important to understand that as you look at the issues that we find, is that over 90% of them require partnership with the vendor to address. There's not a lot of vulnerabilities that we identify that my organization can take action without engaging the device manufacturer. So this bit of statistics I hope will help reinforce as we talk about some further slides. So when you think about reducing risk through proactive actions, I'm going to talk about 8 specific actions today. And really the key point of these actions really starts with ensuring that as much as you can, you push the security to the front of the device decision-making process. So again, in that procurement part, and you're going to see that theme as I talk about how we've laid out our strategy going forward. So the first point is really setting a security standard. And for Mayo Clinic, we've chosen to utilize ISO 80001. And for those on the joining today who are or not aware, the medical device statement for medical device security, or an MDS2 form, is something that medical device manufacturers currently complete and provide and make available to purchasers of their products. And this ISO 80001 is in alignment and part of how that form is structured. So this was a natural fit for us. And so ISO actually has 19 capabilities, and I'm not going to walk through them, But I think it's important for you to be aware. Pick a standard that the vendor or the manufacturers will be familiar with, and that's why we chose this one. They're familiar. We're not creating anything new either, and we feel that's important because every once in a while we hear people say, oh, we need to create a standard for medical devices. Well, we don't really need to create a standard. We just need to apply or repackage an existing standard. So what Mayo's done in our journey is, based on the 19 ISO capabilities, we've come up with 77 requirement criteria or statements that we seek information from medical device manufacturers as they're looking to sell us a product. And again, as you think about your journey of a security standard, I really urge you, don't recreate the wheel, reuse what you can and what's already available in the industry. So as an example, I just wanted to show you a couple of screenshots of some of our requirements. I said we had 77 requirement criteria, and I'm going to highlight a couple of them, and we're going to build on that as we go through some of our process. But so, for example, one of our statements is, do you prohibit the use of shared accounts? We don't like generic accounts in our environment. They're hard to manage, hard to control, and you don't know who used them. We want to prohibit the use of hard-coded passwords and encryption keys. And then we talk about the operating system quite a bit. So tell us about, is the OS currently supported by the manufacturer? So is Microsoft still supporting it? And then the next question is really about the device manufacturer, and are you applying updates and patches on a routine basis? You'll notice we just say routine. We're not prescriptive. We want to understand what that vendor is capable of. So once you've selected a standard, then you really need to establish minimum security requirements. And for Mayo Clinic, we've kind of coined this kind of a bar of goodness, so to speak, and we have 6 base requirements, and they're listed in the little brown boxes. And so really, these are table stakes, so to speak. So we do ask that we expect the medical device to run a supported operating system. So we don't want it to be running XP today, soon to be Windows 7. We want it to receive routine OS patching. We want it to have antivirus applied and updated. We also, and actually much prefer, whitelisting technology, but we're looking for something to protect that device from malware or ransomware. We're looking to see if there's third-party software on this piece of equipment. Is that routinely patched? We expect the manufacturer, if they're using that on their device, that they take care in feeding for it. Does it contain hard-coded passwords? And last but not least is complying with Mayo Clinic's work account standards. So in essence, are you meeting these base minimum requirements? When we first got started with this, we sometimes, even within clinical areas, we would get a bit of a pushback from both manufacturers, medical device vendors, as well as occasionally from a few practice areas. And I guess the one thought that I always bring back to the table when we look at these baseline requirements is, would anyone go out, whoever's asking this question, go out, buy a new computer at a technology store that doesn't run a supported OS, doesn't receive routine operating system patches, doesn't have antivirus applied and updated, and doesn't have, say, Internet Explorer receiving periodic patches, and then put that computer on your personal Wi-Fi, connect to the internet and do your personal banking? There really isn't anyone I've ever talked to who said they would do that, but the bigger question then comes back, why would we expect to treat a patient with a medical device that can't meet those requirements? So again, we need to bring that back into the context of this device and how it can have and potentially a negative impact on our patients.
Hey, Deborah, do you mind if I interrupt real quick? So we're getting lots of questions, and I'm thinking that we may not be able to get to all of them, but one I wanted to ask from someone who joined, what are the more common security issues that you see the medical device vendors need to mitigate based upon your assessment of new products? So are there common security issues that you see them time and time again?
And that's a really good question, and it's kind of opportunistic right now that I have this slide up, because a lot of times some of the biggest issues are with these base requirements that we have. We have not done an assessment of a medical device in our journey to date that meets all 6 of those baseline requirements. So looking at patching is a key thing for us. Looking at work accounts, those are areas where we tend to struggle with medical device manufacturers. Some are actually getting better, but probably the biggest issue is the AV, the whitelisting technology for the third, down in the brown bars, the operating system patching and the third-party software. Those are, for the most part, some of what I would call the low-hanging fruits that we see repeatedly. And if I can add one more, because we do look for other things beyond these 6 base requirements, is we do see many medical devices that do not have good authentication practices. So for example, they may auto log on, or they require local accounts versus a connection to our Active Directory. So you notice that's not one of our base requirements. And you know, just to be quite honest, if we asked for everything we really wanted, we get the deer in the headlight look. So we try to focus in on these base requirements. I hope that helps.
I'm sure it does. Thanks, Debra.
Okay. So many times I get the question, if a vendor, if I say we haven't seen a device that's met all 6 requirements as we're looking to buy it, so what do we do? So really, our first ask is we have a conversation with the device manufacturer and the clinical proponent who's buying it, the clinical department, and we seek a mitigation or a remediation action prior to purchase. If that's not possible, then we go for a commitment from the vendor to address the issue, and we identify what they plan to do and set a timeline, which gets documented. And the third option is if the device manufacturer just looks at us and says, we're going to do nothing to address this, then this is when we do a pause. I don't say we stop the purchase, because we never forbid the purchase. My group does not. I don't have authority to do that. But I do have authority to pause the purchase. And that means that we would partner with the practice area to put through a request to a governance group, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that will do centralized risk acceptance. For Mayo Clinic, it's no longer acceptable for one clinical department to make a security risk decision that can impact the entire organization. So that's really the journey that we've had. And I can maybe think of 2 times we've had to go to step 3. Most of the device manufacturers, once they understand the issues, are very willing to come to the table and partner with us. Now, the length of time it takes to get things fixed may not be our preferred timeline, but at least we are seeing some collaborative and come forward to help us address these issues. So as you think about option or the next thing that we might want to do is to think about evaluating new purchases. So as we do that, we focus on high priority devices. Each medical device is not created equal, so we need to determine what we care about. And so for my team, we care the most about devices that could cause serious patient harm. The next thing that we look at is the greatest potential for wide disruption to care processes. And the third is the impact to the network. So again, we clearly need to, because of the nature of the equipment, focus on patient harm. We do engage stakeholders across Mayo Clinic, and we also engage the vendor. And I want to highlight one other thing that I think is really important that some may not be thinking about, but we've coined a term called a device family. And what that means to us is when you think of a medical device, they typically are not sold where you just buy that one piece of equipment. They tend to come with other peripherals. So if you think of an infusion pump, the pump itself that is used to administer the drugs in and of itself is probably less interesting from a security perspective. but those pumps have to communicate to a drug library, a drug formulary server, and they also and that server communicates to a workstation. So when I talk about a device family, it's following that data flow in every point of where that device family could be compromised. So it could be the workstation, the server, or the endpoint or pump. And so you need to understand how the data flows and how the communication happens, because there's some, the more interesting components to look at are how is the database, the server and workstation managed. And then the other part about that, about evaluating new purchases, is to ensure that it's repeatable. And I am sharing some images on the right side as to, how we determine patient harm. So we rely on our healthcare technology management colleagues who are accountable for JACO risk rating of medical equipment. We utilize some of their scoring, and then we created a heat map in the bottom right corner to help us determine how we our care factor for those pieces of equipment. So again, kind of building a bit on the evaluation, in addition to our questions, we do have an algorithm that helps us understand the priority of the pieces of equipment we're assessing. And so we kind of look at three components within the algorithm. One is about compliance with Mayo's policy. So it's really those 6 base requirements. We have policies that align with each of them. We look at the impact for patient care, so safety, workflow, and then we look at compliance for all of our ISO requirements, which equates to what's the impact to Mayo's network. So again, we focus on patient harm, and we do have a workflow that helps us determine that prioritization, and we've kind of coined it a do we care about the device, and then how much do we care about it. So as we think about do we care about the piece of medical equipment, our primary level of caring, where we kind of push it to the side and say, thank you, you can proceed without an assessment, is if this device does not go on the network. And we've had to ask that question 6 ways. You see on the screen that we ask it multiple ways. And the reason being, when we initially asked this question, many times we were getting a response back that said, no, we're not on the network. And then another question would say, oh, we use this tool for remote access. And so it was conflicting, and so we're a little bit tighter in how we ask those questions. So if you are on Mayo's network, then we have an algorithm within our vendor packet that allows us to prioritize this. And again, you'll see at the top, we're going to look at our policy impacts, those critical base requirements. Second is patient harm, and again, we use the factor of the clinical application and equipment function, along with the number of devices that are being acquired or like devices in use. And then the overarching third component is ISO compliance with all of those 77 requirement questions. And so that algorithm will nicely turn that to say no review is needed, or it will turn red and it will say an in-depth review is needed. So that's really how Mayo Clinic takes our approach on being able to assess medical equipment. And behind the scenes, we also have a vendor packet that contains 6 deliverables that I'm happy to talk about later if others have questions about it. The fourth component that we think people can proactive action people can take is regarding contract and security requirements. So Mayo's approach has been, we seek, and I use the word seek because we're not always effective, but we are getting much more effective at this, at getting security language in our purchase contract. And our contract language is really broken into 2 different components. One is about the vendor's written security program. And so thinking about that, this is really about understanding the security posture of that device manufacturer's organization. And you might wonder why it is we care about that. Well, there's two reasons one will care. If you remotely support that device in Mayo Clinic's environment, that umbilical cord between our organizations causes us to care. The second caring point would be about, do they ever take our PHI off-site? So if you trip one of those triggers, we expect you to negotiate some contract language about their own security programs. So we ask about roles and responsibilities. We have some requirements that we build into our contract language around that. access, disposal, and then we do talk a bit about breach notification and how that transpires between their organization and ours. So specifically, if you're connected with a remote connection to Mayo, if something bad gets through to Mayo Clinic and you believe that to be the case, we want to be aware so that way we can quickly respond and react. So all of that gets built into that part of the contract language associated with the vendor's written security program. So I do have one caveat. We do allow that not to be needed if the device manufacturer is a SOC 2 Type 2 certification. But I can share that we barely ever run into that, so typically we are negotiating this part of the contract language. The second part of the language aligns with product security requirements. So what are the security requirements we're looking for in the product we're actually buying and placing in our network to treat our patients with? We're looking for compliance with FDA guidance. We're looking for testing and scanning requirements. So we outline in our contract language what we want, and many times we do have to negotiate this, but we're looking for compliance with the SANS Top 25, with OWASP Top 10, looking for the ability for Mayo to test this if we so choose, and that they follow a certain level of testing rigor and methodology as these tests are being done. And so we do provide some documentation in our vendor packet about that. So we cover that in our language, so it gives us an understanding about how much security testing that manufacturer did on the device. We also look at installation standards. So when you come and you install this in our environment, do you remove unneeded ports and services? Do you document them? Do you remove the unneeded? Do you remove all installation media so you're not leaving any pertinent pieces of information that a threat actor could use to further exploit the device? What's your development standards, password requirements? And again, you're going to see reference in some of these. So associated with passwords, we say we look for no hard-coded passwords, no persistent administrative privilege. A lot of these tie back to our base security requirements. And then we do seek to get indemnification in our contracts for security incidents. And also, again, what's their response level for security issues that they've been made aware of. So we want this all discussed up front. And so one of the key lessons learned as I think about contract language and negotiating red lines is it's been very helpful for us to take each of our requirements in our contract language and tie those back to standards such as NIST, ISO, FDA guidance, because it makes that conversation maybe a little bit easier to say, well, wow, you want to redline out this aspect of not utilizing appropriate password requirements. Well, that violates these current standards. This isn't just Mayo saying it. And so it makes those redline negotiation meetings a bit easier. So as we look at moving on to the fifth proactive action, and that's really around having some remediation and mitigation actions thought through before you start doing an assessment. So when I think of pre-purchase, some things that we've done is we seek to have the vendors test simple remediation mitigation options. So a simple example is if the manufacturer says, no, we don't have antivirus on our product and you can't put it on there, well, could we partner with you to try it and see if it works, or does it break the device? There are options for us to plug a device in. We could do implement process changes in the practice. So at some points, devices don't have to be routinely on Mayo's network. So if it's a vulnerable device, can we leave it off and only attach it to the network when upgrades are needed with the vendor? Can we do partial fixes? So if the device comes with default passwords, can we change that to be unique to Mayo's institution? I'm not asking you to give me a unique password for all 100 devices we're buying, but can we make it one common for Mayo that we can manage? Disabling unused and unneeded parts of the product, looking for general system updates and cleanup. These are some simple things that our group looks at as we go through the assessment process. So really the key of this is to establish whatever action you agree to and establish that timeline before the check is written to the vendor, so that way you have maybe a little bit more leverage to proceed forward. When you talk about a post-purchase or a legacy device, and I am throwing this in here because it is a bit near and dear to my heart, we really have fewer options. So many times we see there's no remediation options available, and at that point, really all we can do is monitor and apply detective controls. If there's no AV or whitelisting, we may seek to try and isolate it on our network. We may look for changing high-risk configurations in partnership with a device vendor. But to be quite honest, most of what we see here in a post-purchase or a legacy device are really handcrafted, and they're very resource-intensive. And many of these changes, we simply require the vendor's assistance for, and so it just makes it a bit more difficult for us as a customer to deal with on our own. So this is one of the main reasons why we have focused in on what's coming in the door.
Hey, Deborah, let me interrupt real quick again. A question came in earlier. This may be a useful time to ask this one. How are you balancing your liability of testing devices, so ensuring their proper function, with holding vendors accountable? So some of the big vendors have years in software testing and patch upgrade releases. Do you have any best practices outside of what you've already shared that you can share? And do you think healthcare providers can partner to move this part of it more quickly?
Sure, good question. I think I understand the testing question. If the person that asked it, if I'm not hitting what you're asking, please ask it again. So when think about testing of equipment, I shared Mayo does some testing. And so what we do is if we choose to do a test of a piece of medical equipment, we will ask the vendor to provide us the test system, come on site, set it up, and participate in the first couple of days of our assessment, which it likely can take 3 weeks. It could be longer, but likely 3 weeks is our good average. So our goal with the testing is to have the vendor engaged so that there's not this callback that says, oh, you didn't install the device right, or you misconfigured it. We ask them to install it and configure in the way it will come to our environment when we put it in production. And then the second question you asked about moving this forward faster, and that's one of Mayo's main reasons for sharing what we do is we think as an industry, healthcare organizations need to band together and to have a louder voice. Mayo's a big organization, but we can't do this alone. So we're hoping that if other healthcare organizations can learn from what we've done in the investment that Mayo's made in this, we're more than happy to share and partner with vendors as we move along. It's not to the point where we will share information about products. That hasn't been our approach to date, but we're more than happy to share our strategy, our documentation, our approaches alike. I hope I answered those questions for the...
You've already gotten a response. Very helpful. So, good stuff. Continue on.
All right. So thinking about governance, Mayo Clinic is maybe in a bit of a different scenario because we are physician-led. We love committees. So Mayo Clinic does have a formal executive-led Mayo Clinic Security Committee, and that committee is structured to protect Mayo Clinic's assets. So they will cover physical security, they will cover cybersecurity, they deal with anything security related. And they really are, again, led by physicians. We do have, like our chief administrative officers on it, obviously our head of our legal department, communications, IT, obviously information security is represented, physical security. And so they're the ones who help set the course for Mayo Clinic regarding policies and ensuring best practices are implemented in our organization. And they are accountable for that risk acceptance. And so I think this is something that I think is extremely important and something for other healthcare organizations to consider, because leaving one clinical practice area to make that risk acceptance decision on their own, you may or may not get a high enough level purview to the organization to get the appropriate input on that. And so really that's my key point on this slide, and why I share it is that acceptance has to be done at the appropriate level in the organization. And this has been in place for us for 2 years now, and it was a huge culture shift within our organization. The seventh thing I'd like to talk about is making sure that you have a communication plan. So if you're going to make changes to processes, so again, I'm focusing in on building security into the procurement process, there's a lot of communication that has to happen, so don't forget that part of it. So thinking internally, we had a lot of communication with our practice areas, with the funding committees who fund capital purchases, finance, leadership, various groups within Mayo Clinic. And we did top-down communication that started probably about 3 months prior to the change. And we did bottoms-up type communication that was very targeted, that my team did. And so we went out and talked to some of the clinical practice areas that I list here, such as radiology, surgery labs, that are big buyers. And we had targeted meetings and sessions with them to explain what was going to happen. So again, we don't want to pull the rug out from underneath them. And a key point for us is not making frequent process and documentation changes, because the practice areas, they struggle to keep up with that. So our mantra is we focus on an annual change to this process. The other communication part is really having external communication. And so we needed to make sure that the medical device manufacturers were aware of what Mayo Clinic was going to be doing when we executed our plan. And that fully went live in 2017. And so we held education sessions about 2 months prior to implementation, and we partnered with our supply chain management colleagues to invite in some of our largest device manufacturers. And they came on site at Mayo. We didn't allow people to participate via phone because we felt this was critical enough that they come on site. And we spent 4 hours with them sharing, Mayo's approach, sharing our new vendor packet, sharing our documentation requirements, how the process will work. We gave them draft copies of our information security schedule, and then we held follow-up calls with the vendors so that if they had targeted questions they didn't want to ask in front of some of their competitors, they were comfortable in doing so. We also are presenting and sharing. We've shared many times at various organizations, either through NHISAC, HIMSS, Vizient events, SMI, just as Barry had mentioned, and the like. So we want to share our strategy and communicate it out to our other healthcare organizations, as well as hit some of the device manufacturers that may not have been targeted with that. And then, again, we do share our documentation with anyone who's interested in having it. And our point to the device manufacturers is we want to have a clear documentation expectation from them. So we did partner with a couple of our very key manufacturers, and they gave us some very good feedback on our approach to ensure that it was clear and as concise as possible. The last proactive action I would share with you is expect compliance with regard to FDA guidance. And again, I shared at the beginning that one of the reasons why our status quo doesn't keep changing, why we are in this status quo mode, is that it is awfully hard when you're dealing with guidance and you don't really have any meat and clout to go after the device manufacturers. But truly know this, and if you talk to Dr. Schwartz from the FDA, she'll be very clear, and this is really a quote that we took from her, that guidance, the guidance is on the how, but cybersecurity is not an option. So again, read and know that guidance so you can effectively talk with device manufacturers about it. So really, those are kind of those key 8 actions, proactive actions that you can take. But there are a couple of other points I'd like to share with you about our journey. And really for us, collaboration is really key. This is not something that we Mayo Clinic can do on our own. This is not something that we think a healthcare provider can do on their own. This really is an industry partnership in this. And so when I think about how we collaborate with our device manufacturers specifically, we have to go beyond what people think of collaboration in the past. So those vendors need to be more comfortable sharing information they typically have it. I don't know how many on this webinar are familiar with the software bill of materials concept, but many manufacturers are very uncomfortable sharing that information with us as the buyer of their product. We just want to know every piece of software that's on here. We don't want to know intellectual property, but I want to know if you're running Internet Explorer, if you have the capabilities to have Adobe Acrobat on here because you need to read PDF files. And, they need to get comfortable with that. And then, we as a provider need to get comfortable with the fact that a device manufacturer is going to fix these things, and we have to apply some of we can't tear down security hardening actions that the vendor's done for us without clear forethought. Another requirement is having that vigorous testing of medical equipment, because currently today the FDA does not test devices or consider security at the same level that Mayo Clinic does when we get our hands on that piece of equipment. So that level of testing needs to expand within the device manufacturer, because we're not going to see the FDA be able to do that. They just do not have the ability to scale to that type of activity. It really does reside with the manufacturer. And then I think we also need, through that collaboration, to understand that we all bring expertise from our organization. So healthcare providers have clinical knowledge, the manufacturers have product technical knowledge, and we need to merge that to understand and ensure we're protecting from various threat use cases and scenarios that could potentially be out there in a global environment. And so thinking about this, occasionally we bump into a device manufacturer who really does not want to collaborate with regards to cybersecurity. They don't want to be as transparent as we want them to be. And what we've conveyed to our practice areas is this may be a vendor you maybe don't want to do business with. And if in fact we're starting to see some of our practice areas, if they've got 3 products, they all have the same clinical function, the same quality as far as care to their patients, they are starting to steer towards those devices that have a more secure posture. And so that's internally, that's a positive thing for our organization, and it makes my team feel good that we actually are making a difference. So a couple of final thoughts is just looking at security and medical equipment. The technology and knowledge does exist, but many times it's people and process that impact our ability to do the right things with respect to hardening medical equipment. And so I just want to throw that out there. We haven't talked a whole lot about that, but they sometimes can be the larger challenge. And when you look at medical device vendors, and I shared that 90% of the time they need to be accountable for fixing them, we both have the responsibility of protecting our patients. So that really means that we as a healthcare delivery organization need to be engaged, and we need to ensure we don't turn off, for example, a firewall that comes turned on and enabled by a device manufacturer without clearly understanding why it's there and ensuring that that's the appropriate action. So again, it's a two-sided coin, and we both need to be part of the solution. Applying collective market pressure is going to really be what drives change more quickly. And this is, somebody asked that question earlier, kind of referencing this, and this is really about creating this large market voice in order to drive that change. And that's really why Mayo Clinic is really out there and again, vocalizing our concern about these pieces of equipment and sharing what we've learned. And we are hearing from device manufacturers that they struggle with documentation that they receive from healthcare delivery organizations. They've asked Mayo, will you share your packet, your process with others so that our work can be leveraged? And in essence, that is the case. Mayo Clinic leadership is in full agreement that they want to be able to leverage the investment that our organization has made over the last 4 years and share any information with anyone interested in understanding it and potentially using it. Information such as, what's our process, what's our documentation, do we have templates, and then again, I'm also able to share draft contract language. And so my key point to you kind of at the end is, this really is a journey. If your organization hasn't started on it, I think it's something you really need to begin now and look for some steady progress. And as you start looking at this, just make sure that you have some transparency around your processes. You have the ability to raise visibility to what you find, apply reasonableness when you think it's standards, and then, truly our group takes the moral high ground. Ultimately, this is about our patients. And so with that in mind, those are 4 key statements that our group follows. And so with that, that's the last prepared slide I have, and I did put my email address at the end. If anybody is interested in having a phone call afterwards or is interested in receiving our packet of information that we use with our medical device manufacturers. And with that, Barry, I'm going to turn it back to you and see if there are any other questions.
That is fantastic, Debra. Great insights, great pace, getting us through some very, kind of in-depth material. So thank you for your participation today. I can't thank you enough. We do have a few questions. I'm going to try and get through these in, by the 5 minutes left. So I want to leave everybody 5 minutes. So we'll end at 12:55 my time, 11:55 your time. The first one is around organizational. I think it's an organizational question. So let me make sure I have it. Where did you go? It is, how did Mayo structure medical device, the medical device security function? Is it part of the biomedical department or part of IT security? And who does medical device security office report up to?
Good questions. The clinical information security team here, my team, we are part of information security. We partner closely with our biomedical engineering group. We call them healthcare technology management. So we are our partners in this, but we are not part of their organization structure. And then also to understand, we have a chief information officer here at Mayo Clinic, and to him reports two peer organizations. One would be information technology and one would be information security. So while we're not embedded in the same department structure, we both IT and security report to the same chief information or information officer. And then ultimately we do give routine reports to our board. So I hope that helps.
Excellent. No, that's great. And one more. This one may be a little bit, I'm not sure if it's in your scope, but it might be. Automated tool. What automated tools does Mayo use to inventory and manage medical devices, as there are some new automated solutions in the market, such as Zingbox, Mitigate, and CloudPost? I don't know if those ring a bell, but I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Actually, this is a very timely question. Mayo Clinic does not, to this date, own one of those tools, but we are looking at our options with respect to those, and this would be an activity that I would highlight that my group would be partnering with HT, with our biomedical engineering on how best to proceed forward with that, and then looking at product offerings and what might be best for both the security needs of that tool as well as the management of medical equipment needs. There's a lot of products out there. We've looked at many, and we are actually going to be doing some proof of concepts of a couple of selected tools, but I'm not at liberty to share which ones they are.
Sure, of course, that's great, and thank you for that, Debra. One last question, and actually this is one from me, but before we sign off, I do want to remember everybody who's still on, there's going to be, remind everybody who's still on, there will be a survey after this. We would love your feedback. Please take a few minutes to complete it. It's the only way we can know what worked and what didn't, so it'll help us improve. Now, the last question, I guess it's more of a comment too. Much of the material that you go through as it kind of relates to the suppliers, my guess is that it would require input from R&D teams rather than, say, some of the folks that you may more frequently deal with from the supplier side, say national accounts teams or commercial teams. I think this is a good opportunity. Maybe you see it, and this may be where the question comes from. Do you see some suppliers who are integrated on their side where R&D is part of these discussions, supply chain is part of the discussions, the commercial team is part of it, where they work cross-functionally internally to come to you and say, you know, we are working together on our side to address the cybersecurity concerns that exist out there? Does that make sense? And if it does, do you see anyone who's kind of working at that level?
Yeah, we are starting to see some medical device manufacturers become more mature internally with respect to what you're saying. Historically, you know, when we ask targeted questions, so for example, our packet of requirements, you're right, having the national accounts rep answer those questions, they can't. And so they're trying to figure out and maneuver through their own organization. But we are starting to see more partnership and collaboration on like product lines. And in some cases, we're starting to see have meetings with some device manufacturers where their engineering group and their national accounts rep, their product teams, they're starting to reach out and ask proactive questions about security and products that they're getting ready to send forward to the FDA for certification. So I see this as a positive thing. While we're not there yet, I see some very positive movement in the industry with some of the device manufacturers.
Awesome. Debra, I can't thank you enough. This was great. And again, for those who are still on, please complete the survey at the end. And also we did record this, so, you know, come back, revisit it, download the slides, share it with your team members. And as Debra mentioned, you can obviously send her questions directly through email. So thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Debra, and have a great day.